so much for joining me on the second episode of Art of the Duo. The reason why I've started this series is that I'm really interested in the inner workings of musicians like yourself and the process and methodology in a duo setting. But this just isn't pertaining to vocalists. So even though that interests me because I'm a vocalist myself, it's kind of the duo settings that you have played in over the years with, you know, a number of musicians that I'd love to talk about it, you know, through this kind of chat. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of start with a little bit about your background, because what I love about you as a musician is that you play a lot of styles. You know, you play incredible, you know, jazz guitar, but you also cross over. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just your background.
No one in the family was musical, but both my parents really liked music, so there was just the radio playing night and day, you know, records around the house. And actually I did hear also at home like quite a wide cross-section of things. And you know, they were also reasonably interested in instrumental music too, which is another thing, you know, because you know, being an instrumentalist, I guess there just has to be that realization that that's possible. You know, like a lot of people just see music as just singer and stuff that's backing the singer, you know.
True, very true.
Not that that's a bad thing. I think it's good to get in touch with that too. But yeah, just those kind of possibilities were all sort of floating there in the background. I just started looking into stuff.
Yeah. And would you say, did you go the academic route, do you think, or were you someone that was very much playing gigs before you sort of studied and things like that?
I did sort of start playing some gigs with a little band I was in. It was all sort of happened around the same time. And to be honest, I think my parents were pretty horrified when I just sort of announced I was going to be a guitar player. I think it really took them by surprise, actually, as much as anything. And so going the academic route was a great way for them to sort of go, oh, okay, this is a legit thing. And especially when somehow I managed to ask my way into the con. I don't know how, to this day. But, you know, I don't know, there must have been something there that they saw and said, okay, you can come. And it seemed like overnight my parents went, oh, okay, you know, he must actually have some sort of talent for this. Because, I mean, it's not that they weren't encouraging, they were very encouraging, but there's kind of no frame of reference. You know, like we didn't, apart from my teacher, we didn't know any musicians. You know, it just seemed like a very distant, faraway thing. So then, you know, it actually became true that, there might be like a legitimate pathway for this. And I think they were much relieved. And I don't know, I was a little bit, for the first couple of years, I was a little bit flaky about it, actually, about sort of formal study of music.
Yep.
As so many students find, it sometimes takes the pleasure right out of it. But I don't know, I stuck with it, and eventually your interest just seems to take over, and the last couple of years of it I really enjoyed it.
And you played in a lot of, you know, different settings, right? So I was reading in your bio, you know, you've played in lots of bands, you've played in theatre, and also sort of different styles. So you've been in this wonderful sort of bluegrass group. What are you sort of thinking about as a guitarist when you're moving through these different, you know, genres and styles and different kind of setups, being in the pit, in an orchestra pit in, say, a theatre, versus you at a festival with a bluegrass band, versus you in a duo setting with myself? What are you kind of thinking about those different setups? Does that change the way you're playing?
Well, I think when I was younger, I think it definitely did. But as I've gotten older, I've just tried to basically keep the same approach going for everything. And there might be technical things that change from style to style, and that could be as much physical, like just what kind of instrument you're using. And, you know, I guess you have to fulfill whatever role it is that you're doing. So, I mean, even with the theatre stuff, most of the theatre I've done has been fairly well, I wouldn't say underground, but not particularly mainstream.
Okay.
Like I've done a little bit of sort of pit work.
Yeah.
But there's people who do that all the time, and that's their thing. I've enjoyed that kind of work, and I guess I read well enough to do it. So that you can kind of just step in and do some things like that occasionally. But yeah, more and more I've found I just try to keep everything as I play, and then deal with the music as it comes through that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And so then moving into sort of a little bit about the duo setting. What is your experience in that kind of setting, versus a duo versus a quartet trio? I guess do you play in duo settings very often? And what changes? Like does everything stay the same as a guitarist, or is it different?
Yeah, it's quite different. It's something I've thought a bit about over the years, and I have done a fair bit of it. I was thinking about it today and thinking, well, mostly I practice it a lot just playing with my students. Like you've got people who are kind of training to be jazz guitarists or whatever, and I do a lot of accompanying for them. And so things that I've learned, I sort of realised things that I've learned from for playing duo with other people, I've gradually developed and practiced from playing with my students. And I don't know, it's probably, I think it's useful for them to be playing with usually an older, more experienced musician. So that's always the point of it. I always just get people to try and play or play together. That's usually a big part of it. And yeah, I've done a fair bit of developing of that sort of thing especially in the last 10 years or so. But before that, I used to just sometimes think of it really different ways, I know I first started doing it and just went, oh, well, I've got to get into this just for professional reasons. In that it's a way for like a small unit to go in somewhere and earn some money and play. And therefore I have to learn to deal with this just on that level.
Yeah.
And I kind of did. Although it took a long time. Like nothing I'd learned up to that point kind of had prepared me for, it seemed, what was required. Nothing, it just was like relearning from the bottom up. But gradually I have started realizing again that it would be nice to just, the way you play with other people, no matter what the setting is, basically how you go about it. And that took a lot of experimenting, getting stuff wrong.
Yeah. And could you articulate for me a little bit more, like, let's say we've got some guitarists that would like to know a bit more, or they've just begun, or you've been playing for a while. Could you tell me a little bit more about that, like specifically to your instrument?
Well, I find it's very helpful to know the song, or to know how the song goes, to have experience with just how the music should sound. So that can take a long time in itself. But there's a massive difference between learning something from the sheet music, which is what a lot of people do when they start out in that sort of field, versus learning it by ear. It's a funny one because it's especially for me, with no sort of musical background, it takes a long time for your ear to develop to the point of you can listen to like a jazz record and go, oh, okay, I can hear what's going on there, I can hear the key, all these things that are important to that music. And I guess that's the same with any record, really, with any kind of thing. But it seems like a very big area for that. So I think parallel to actually playing the guitar, it's also these other musical elements that you really have to work on. And that's all the things about harmony, ears, style, swing, repertoire, songs, different singers, You know, like I think it's really important to have just checked out, you know, the major singers and just say, okay, I've got to be familiar with how Ella Fitzgerald sounds. I've got to be familiar with how Sarah Vaughan sounds. And, you know, if you're the sort of person who's systematic about it, you could just make a list and go, okay, who are the top 10 great jazz singers?
Yeah.
And work your way down. Most people don't do that. It's a much more kind of learn as you go approach.
Yeah.
But, you know, maybe we're in the era where making lists and that kind of research is definitely more possible.
Definitely.
You know, if I say to someone, okay, you should know this album, you can have it on your device in like a minute, you know. Whereas someone said to me when I was a kid, oh, you should know this album. It took a fair bit of searching to find. You know, like you could say to the person, oh, well, could you tape it for me or lend it to me or I've got to go somewhere and get it, or, you know, all those things that would happen. Sometimes that kind of search was good. But, so research.
Yeah.
Just doing research into what you're trying to do, I think is really helpful.
Yeah.
And that's before even all the things of, you know, learning to play all the particular kinds of chord shapes you're going to need on the guitar. And all those other actual physical playing things. I must admit, one thing that helped me a lot with moving into that sort of jazz area was getting an Archtop guitar. I resisted for the longest time. And there's still people who know me from, you know, like 20 years ago or more of just always playing solid body guitars.
Yeah.
And that was great actually for band work. I still sometimes miss playing those kind of guitars in bands, for, you know, for jazz groups. Like I do still play on my Fenders for other things. But an Archtop guitar, there was just something about it that is a little easier to get that sound for duo. It's a little bit more acoustic and a little warmer. And I think that was a good step for me to finally just go, I've got to do it, you know. And I mean, part of the reason for all that was just financial. I never could scrape the money together or find a decent instrument. You know, all those things when you're young that were just hard. So.
I want to ask, for those that don't know, what is the difference between an Archtop versus, did you say full-bodied guitar?
Solid body guitar.
Solid body guitar.
Well, it's like the kind of difference between the classic sort of Fender Telecaster or Stratocaster, you know, like you would see Jimi Hendrix playing or someone like that, versus the kind of sort of more acoustic looking instrument that has F holes in it, like you'd see someone like Joe Pass playing. So obviously one is really just designed to be plugged in and really played as loudly as you want, you know, with a loud modern band.
Yeah.
You know, whereas acoustic guitars sort of aren't designed for that. They're much more resonant. You know, you can't really turn them up as loud. Although I also must admit that the guitar I play is sort of a sneaky guitar, and that has it's designed so that if I wanted to play it in a loud rock band, I could. So, you know, it doesn't quite have the same just purely acoustic resonance as some other Archtops would have, but it's got that versatility to it that's really great for someone who came up with those kind of instruments, you know, and it just means like dealing as an adult with things that you probably learn to deal with when you're younger. You know? Yeah,
that's great.
Well, without sort of showing pictures, that would be...
Yeah. I'll put them up there. I'll flash.
Yeah. Having said that, though, like there's plenty of people doing all kinds of things with all kinds of guitars, and they always have. You know what I mean? Like you can see, you know, heaps of people playing beautiful jazz with like Telecasters and things like that. And, you know, heaps of people playing like loud, funky things with like jazz type guitars, you know, so it's not so much the guitar that does it, but I did find for duo situations it did make a difference.
That's great. Another question I had is when you are working in a duo setting, let's say you're playing with a bass player, let's say you're playing with Helen Russell, or you're playing then with another guitarist because you're saying you're teaching a lot, which means that you're accompanying in a way a guitarist. But then you may play with a singer or you might play with another instrument. Does that change? Like, does your role generally have to be the same, or are you able to explore different roles within different duo settings, or is it generally the same the way you're thinking about playing?
Um, I think that the things I play definitely would change. I think it's really just listening to whoever you're playing with and leaving a space for them. So, if I'm playing with a bass player, especially a really great creative bass player like that, who has great ears and can just hear whatever I do, um, you know, I don't need to be supplying a lot of low end information, all the time. So um, I could, play a lot of chord voicings, I suppose, that don't have like the root note in them or don't have a lot of low notes. Having said that, though, it's also balanced by trying to use the whole instrument. So that's something I learned as well over time. That it's like, okay, I can try to use the whole range of what's available on the instrument. Not just a limited mid-range of where I think my role should be. But for whoever's playing, it's nice to stay out of their way. It's all, it can be the difference too with different types of singers. Like some people's voices are naturally higher than others. Like even in female singers, for example. So you might want to be staying a little bit more out of the way in particular chords, like being careful that the top note of your voicing's not interfering with what the melody note is. All of those kind of things. And male voices are different again because they're right in the mid-range. So you sort of want to be supplying that information, but you also don't want to be just getting in the way of that. Yeah, it's a really interesting one.
That is really interesting. So you really have to be quite versatile and creative, on the spot and having to think on your feet and also have the skill set to do it, right? Because there's one thing saying, okay, I have to stay out of the way of that, that male voice versus female, but actually having the toolbox to say, okay, well, can I play that chord in a different inversion or a different, voicing is kind of then that's the kind of training, isn't it?
Yeah, it just took me so long. I would consider I'm self-taught with all this stuff, really,
Right.
even though I had teachers over the years. But like I said, there sort of wasn't much that can prepare you for this other than actually doing it. And maybe that's why I get my students to accompany me as well, just so that they have an idea of what that's going to be like. And that can throw up all kinds of things.
Totally, but it's a really good point to actually sort of, well, I think for that whole doing thing, music is a doing. It's kind of it's learnt by the action of it, I feel, and it can
Yeah,
get a little bit sort of we can think a lot about it, and and even in classroom we can kind of be like, oh, this is this and this is that, but I think the learning of it really goes back to you doing it and then figuring it out that way, and then with that information you can use to kind of consolidate. But I think just
definitely.
sitting in a classroom going, okay, well, that's C, E, G, that's a major chord, and you might listen to it, actually being able to play that, and I don't know, I think there's something to that.
I
Mm,
fully agree.
mm,
It's a real coordination thing. I keep saying to students, like you're really trying to learn these actions and
mm,
then put them together in time. And for any one action, you might be able to execute it beautifully, as well as your teacher, or with a really nice sound, or as well as you like. But where it comes into it is like, well, okay, can I move from this action to this action to this action, and connect them all up? And yeah, I've sort of feel like I've gotten some useful practice out of trying to do that.
Yeah.
and encouraging encouraging people I talk to about it to do that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, that's one thing that I kind of learned from bluegrass players.
Mm.
Because all that is very physical. Like you're really trying to play an acoustic instrument with as much projection, beautiful sound, and oftentimes, crazy tempos and things like that. And in that situation, the guitar is the quietest instrument. So all the other instruments in those bands, like, fiddle or banjo or mandolin, they're all much louder than guitar. So, it took like a different kind of way of looking at it to go, well, the harder I hit this instrument, the more it's going to close down because, acoustic instruments, if you start kind of hitting them hard with how you're playing, they actually tend to close up and compress. Whereas if there's like a brisk kind of attack that's firm but not too compressing, the instrument sort of blossoms out, and you have to, for it to make it work, you have to kind of get out of the way of the instrument projecting.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
It drove me crazy. And the first sort of transition from sort of moving from being an electric player into doing that was just really alarming, because it's just like, oh my God, my sound is so puny, and I'm hitting hard and I can't hear myself. And I don't know, it's also like your ear seems to click over as well into listening for that sort of nuance. So that's an area that's really helped me with that kind of thing. I think that I just make a better sound on guitar in general these days. Yeah.
And you sort of feel like that came from that bluegrass kind of background, or
Definitely.
getting into
Yeah.
bluegrass. Mm.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Yeah, I mean, I always have played the acoustic guitar, so and have been interested in that kind of music. But again, it was a little like the jazz thing, and it seemed even more distant and harder to find people who not only were that interested in it, but also just knew how it actually worked, and how to go about playing the instrument that way. I mean, when you finally do find the people that go, oh, you just do this, and you do this, and you go, oh, but sometimes it would like take me a year to realize that someone's playing with a capo on a recording. And you're just listening to it going, oh, listen to that recording. That is so resonant and beautiful and fantastic, and I've worked out the notes and I can physically do it, but when I play it, it just sounds so piss weak. And then, of course, you go, oh, that's because there's a capo.
That is brilliant.
I know, things like that.
Yeah. And I think,
Self-taught.
yeah, it has its downfalls as well. But
I really think so. Yeah.
But I think too, though, like I've been listening to a podcast recently, and it's a songwriting podcast, and I was listening to a couple of songwriters, and one of them was a bluegrass singer-songwriter. And what was really amazing was she came up through that whole kind of, I guess, background of where you have older musicians that sort of mentor you. And she was quite young, like 5 or 6 years old, and they'd get her to sing like a song, and then they got her on the fiddle, and she was then playing this music and just, by osmosis, by being a part of this community, that's how she learnt in a way. So even though she might not have, I guess, been formally taught, she was learning with some sort of mentor in that kind of respect.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I don't know if that sort of thing is as available as much these days in the jazz world.
Yeah.
Maybe because it's seen as a little bit more academic. There's kind of less learning like that. But it probably still is a good way to learn if you're lucky enough to, be in that kind of environment.
Yeah. I think so. Like, I'm starting to think a lot about it actually recently. And I think there's so much to say about that kind of upbringing, with music and things like that. But sort of moving into the sort of similar thing, like, so how is it that you got into this National Bluegrass Championships and won flat picking? Can you tell me what flat picking is? Like, what is this?
Flat picking is just acoustic guitar playing with a plectrum.
Okay.
In that field, it's usually just referred to as a flat pick to distinguish it from like finger picks. Like banjo players and dobro players and people like that. They use finger picks like a thumb pick and a kind of curved pick that go at the end of your fingers. Whereas a flat pick is just a normal plectrum. So yeah, it's interesting because flat picking itself is like this nerdy subgenre of bluegrass. That you could sort of keep nerding out on that without actually being in a bluegrass band. But eventually you get into bluegrass bands and go, oh, okay, I see how this works. And then again, there's also old time music, which is like a whole other thing again. I've been learning to play the claw hammer banjo, and that's like a really just a massive, massive world and a different kind of repertoire and a whole other technique of learning to play an instrument.
That is really cool. And I love that you're always learning in a way, like I know that we are as musicians generally, but do you find there's like almost an excitement when you do? Like, how long have you been playing the banjo for?
Well, I probably first bought a banjo about 10 years ago, so I've been a banjo owner for that time.
Uh-huh.
I just keep, I kept sort of starting and stopping and starting and stopping. And there's a couple of different styles that you can do.
Yeah.
The bluegrass style is like what's called three-fingered or Scrug style, like named after Earl Scrug. And that's like how Bela Fleck plays. So Bela Fleck could probably be a banjo player who's most well known to jazz people. Or maybe the Punch Brothers now, the guy in that plays like that. Whereas claw hammers are like the style that's sort of older than that. It's great for tune playing, but it's not quite as intricate and technical or loud as that stuff. So I just gradually have been around it for that length of time. And just, I don't know, I still had to get someone to sit me down and show me the technique. You know what I mean? Like you can learn lots of things online, and I think this is for any music. There's heaps of fantastic courses online that you can do, but I still think that when it comes down to it, actually playing, you need someone to sit in front of you and go, yes, you're doing it right, or no, do this with your thumb, or your hand has to do this. I had someone help me with that, and then it just sort of went click, and I'm just having a great time playing. But I kind of work on that as well as working on stuff that has to be done professionally.
Yes.
As well as creative things. So
yeah, that is awesome. A little bit about sort of what when you're working, let's say, because I'm a singer, so I'm very interested. When you're working with a vocalist, what are you needing from that vocalist? So, like, what is it that you think of? Like, if you're with a singer, what is it that you need from that singer in order for you to feel like it's going to be a good performance and you're going to enjoy that?
If I think about it, like I need something from them. I feel like it's great if we're both listening to each other, and what I'm playing with is clear enough for them to feel comfortable and do their thing. I guess you could talk about, I need them to be in time and I need them to be in tune and all that sort of stuff, but I don't know if I really if I worry too much about that. Maybe it comes from just really remembering a time when I wasn't much good at that sort of stuff, and am happy for minor mistunings of my guitar to exist and all those kind of things. So I don't know. I don't think about it as much about what I need them to give me. It's more like, okay, am I giving you what you need to make this go? And I mean, like with great singers like yourself, or other great singers I've played for, that it's right. It seems even less of a worry. I'm just like, okay, am I in the right place? Am I just giving them what they need for this to go forward?
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, what I'm hearing is very much a very supportive role. Like your role in a way is to, help that other musician or singer, is very much an accompaniment. Would you say you're thinking of it as an accompanying kind of, for you to work together and enjoy it, you know?
So, I mean, sometimes if I'm comfortable enough,
Right.
I feel like the singer is feeling that kind of security.
Yeah.
And I also will experiment on them a bit.
I love that. That's my favourite part, by the way, is when you start throwing things out, you're like, oh, wicked, and you jump on, you go, whoop, missed that.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, you know. So you can try things and sometimes they come off, and sometimes you might play something together that you've never played before.
Yeah.
And that's really great fun.
Yeah.
Really, really great fun. And that, you know, I think that can happen any time, really, if you're both feeling comfortable enough with, you know, with what you're doing. I don't know. It can be a different thing. Like, if you like with someone, even just in a professional sense, you know, like where, you know, you're just doing this gig for whatever. You know, you might know how someone does something, and know what they're going to sing at any one particular point, and then realize, well, okay, I can do this substitution that I know. You know, that can have a couple of effects, of course. So you can get this look like, whoa, what was that? That was nice. Or they can be like, what are you doing? You know, that's not what goes there. And that's, I guess you have to weigh that up as well. You know, like someone may just be wanting you to lay it down, you know, how they want it, and that's your role. And other times it may be like you can move around a little bit within that. But part of it might be just getting to know people a bit and know what their how they go about it. You know, there might be a singer who really wants you to lay time nicely so they can really phrase against that. You know, so I've had that a couple of times, and especially if you haven't played with the person very much, and you're kind of thinking, okay, what does she really want me to do there? I mean, I can actually delay what I'm playing to go with that, you know, or is this like really a jazz thing that she's wanting? And you know what I mean? Like you hear
Totally.
the effect of these things against each other. So
Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of have to weigh that up. Like that may never be discussed.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember one particular situation where a very good singer had to stop and say, "Oh, you're such a good accompanist, but I really want you to play just time." And you go, okay, yeah, that's what I should do. Yeah. So.
I love that. But that's the thing. In music, we don't always actually explicitly say anything or even say verbally what we want, do we? And sometimes it's actually just playing together and getting kind of feeling it out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really think each person might want it slightly differently. You know,
Yeah.
They may be happy for you to pull around a little bit. Or the drama of it. I mean, sometimes it just gets in my head, like you suddenly imagine that it's Doris Day or something, and you're not some, you know, puny guitar, you're like an orchestra, you know, and she sings a note and like the strings blossom out behind her. And
I love it.
So if I think like that, and that does happen to me a bit, you know, like you just sort of imagine, what if I was, you know, and of course it's not really. It's like kind of going, what if I was George Benson down? And of course you're not, you know, especially me. But I think that thinking that way makes you forget to be worried or forget to be nervous. And if that's the case, then something's more likely to come out creatively and possibly work.
Totally.
Yeah, so
Yep.
Sometimes I do that sort of thing to trip myself into, you know, maybe if you're really nervous or something, and instead of going, I'm not nervous,
Yeah.
just like you can just sort of peep around it and see the music and just sort of sidestep and, you know.
I really like that. I think that's such a wonderful thing to think about for anyone. So we've got a couple of questions left. So what is something you'd like to share with guitarists when they're working in a duo setting and working with singers, so both singers, vocalists and instrumentalists, So what is something they could improve? Like, what is something they should try to get on top of or think about, if they're wanting to, work in a duo setting?
Hmm. Well, I mean, all of these things are probably things I can improve, that's for sure. So, just for my own sake of it, it's probably just being able to really clearly state the harmony. So without it being too complicated, just play like the kind of even simple appropriate choice. So that's one thing that's really helpful. Obviously, timing is another one. That whatever kind of tune you're working on, being able to play it with the right timing, and being able to hook onto someone else's time as well. So that's the other thing. Like, you might have perfect metronomic time, but if you're not hooked in with what you're getting from the other person, then it's not really very helpful. So, I find that's like a thing I really have to work on. I guess that's like listening, I suppose, but listening rhythmically, just not harmonically. That's probably something that I've had to work on a lot because it's always been a bit of a challenge for me. Trying to figure out ways to generate momentum. Like, sometimes you have to think about what's going to propel this music, what makes it go forward. Ironically, with like a jazz standard or something that has a lot of chords, it's that harmonic movement that can just make it move forward. So if you can just play the stuff as it comes in the music, it'll have that momentum. But other times you might be trying to play like a little duo version of some soul thing or something, and that's like, well, okay, how do I, like, I've got to play one chord for 16 bars or something. Like, how do I make that go forward? And there's strategies for it. So yeah, you can look into how to make that go. That seems to be an important thing. Another really important thing is all the stuff like intros, endings, transitions. So if you're playing in a band, it might be, you might be able to skate over turnarounds and things like that. And I know I was kind of guilty of that for the longest time. I used to look at turnarounds and go, that's kind of easy. I know what that is. I don't really have to play that. And most of the time in bands, you don't necessarily have to. But sometimes with duos, you have to be able to play the turnaround. Like, that's an important thing to generate that forward momentum. Like that seems like a really obvious thing, but it's amazing. How we can just skate over like transitions and stuff that makes stuff connect. And endings, of course. It's really helpful to have a little stock of typical endings, including the really cliched ones. I mean, they may be cliches, but you still have to know how to do them.
Yeah, totally.
And sometimes like a really typical ending is what's needed. And even though you may know what it is, you still have to be able to get your hands there in that key, in that tempo, in that situation to do it.
Yeah, true.
That can be hard. That can be something where you can get caught out and go, oh man, I blew it. It's such a simple thing, It happens all the time to me. So they're kind of things that I've really, even when I'm playing with students and things and practicing this stuff, I really try to focus on those things,
Yeah.
And if I'm, if you're bored, then that's where you go, right, what's a different way to do it? What's like a mild challenge that is like, I feel like I can do it with a little bit of work, but it's not like it's impossible. Yeah, those things I think are stuff that I just try to work on all the time.
Yeah,
and sort of fail at, but at least having an idea of them makes you think about how to make that go. How to improve at it.
And I think you used a word that's really interesting because some people see it as a bad thing, but I think music, this idea of failing or not getting it right, is the whole point of music. I think we can't learn it unless we get it wrong somehow at a certain point, right? And I think
Hmm.
as a guitarist, I would assume that you kind of have to, one, if you're starting, you've never met a singer or another instrumentalist before and you're doing a duo thing, you're going to have to take risks. And that person's either going to like it or not like it, right? So already that could be that sense of either failure or you're not doing it right. And then that's where you clarify those things. But not only that, you look at kind of then your own skill set and your fine motor skills, knowing that like, okay, I'm going to change two da da, right? So I go 2 5 1, but then I have to be able to play it in every other key, which means that the
Yeah.
body has to do it, and sometimes you're
Yeah.
not going to get it sometimes, right? Like, so
No.
when you
Yeah.
say that, it kind of like that failing is such a positive thing to me, and I think I think it's important to talk about because it's really like you can't expect to get it right all the time, you know?
No. No. I
Yeah.
fully agree. Sometimes it's just recovering from when things go wrong.
Yes.
That is also part of the coordination.
Mm.
Well, maybe not even if they go wrong, but if you play something and you went, okay, that didn't come out how I expected, but how can I recover? There's a great sort of thing where a good thing to think is yes, and you know, which you say, okay, I've done that, and what am I going to do now? Rather than just going, oh no, because that sort of just puts a full stop on it all. And
Absolutely. I love that yes and. I really think,
yeah,
and in improvisation, it's like the yes and because if you go, if you ever stop or you question it, it stops the whole process. It stops the movement of the music, you
yeah,
know. So it's like, and the conversation needs to be, this is the idea. Oh, yes. And you elaborate rather than going yes. And then you're looking at
yeah.
the person going, okay, well, what's more? Like, you're going to add
I,
anything to the conversation?
I mean, it's not easy to do. There's
No.
always things that can trip you up, but also then that's part of practicing that. That was something that I had to work on too. Was like um, having stuff that would work no matter how I was feeling, or no matter if conditions aren't optimum. So it's not just a matter of yes, I know this would work when it's a beautiful concert and I can hear Ellie perfectly and everyone's listening and really digging it, and it's like
Yeah.
but even then there could be things that could be like upsetting you, like, oh man, that string's a bit out of tune, and what's that buzz coming off the amp, and
Yeah.
I'm not loud enough, I'm too loud, oh, am I racing, oh, am I dragging, oh, what's that chord, oh, I forgot it, oh, I shouldn't have had that coffee before we went on, oh, I should have had a coffee before I went on. Like there's 1,000 things that happen every time we go out to play, and it's kind of, I reckon it's good to practice to have stuff that just works no matter what,
Mm.
or, well, almost no matter what. I mean, obviously there's things that the whole show must go on business is not necessarily the healthiest way to live in the end, but
Yeah.
like that you can cope with all the day-to-day things that maybe just making things not optimum.
Totally.
You're like, oh, we're late, or oh, the PA, or
Yeah.
or listen to these people, they're just drinking and they're not listening to a thing we're doing, and like all of that stuff. I think if you can enjoy playing and have fun even when that's going on, then you've probably practiced the right kind of stuff.
And there's a lot of resilience in that too, isn't there? Like it's not only just your skills, like of playing, but there's also the mindset, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I know we've all had situations where we've gotten upset about various things that have happened
Mm-hmm.
at gigs, before gigs, after gigs, leading up to gigs, all those things that can happen. And I don't know, I think that somehow if you can just keep focusing on music and learning, that those things can, even the worst can slip by the by. Some stuff can take a lot to get over, but yeah, you just have to keep. I have found anyway that focusing on learning and trying to improve and listening to people really helps with that. Mm.
That's fantastic. And is there any records that you dig? Like, I know this is might be out of the blue, but any duo records that you think
Oh
would
yeah.
be that you listen to and people should check out?
Well, I mean, one people have probably talked about Tuck and Patti, like know about them, right? Yeah. And I mean, it's funny now. I think the jury's a bit out on them.
Right.
But back in the day, they were just such an influence on sort of guitarists my age.
Yeah.
People just saw that and just went, "Oh, that's how you do it." And he had solved a lot of problems. Like he had figured out not only how to make that kind of momentum with like jazz standards and things, but also like with funk music and soul music and pop songs, all this other stuff. Like, he had really figured out how to accompany a singer in all of those different kinds of roles. So, like listening to them is probably a good thing. But all the classic stuff like Joe Pass and Ella Fitzgerald, that's just fabulous. It's like really high end, like a high end singer with a guitar player. So you can learn from so much from that. And the thing that Joe plays too, like it's not like a really kind of complicated, highly coordinated technical bass and chords kind of thing. He just sort of lays it out with a good swing, like he just seems to be in the right place at the right time with a beautiful voicing. And then, obviously he can improvise as well, but that stuff is really good to hear. There's a lot of great kind of modern singers. And then some unusual ones, like even just listening to how people accompany themselves when they sing.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So I remember listening a lot to people like Shirley Horn, the way that the kind of beautiful voicings that she would play as she sung. It's I guess it's kind of Bill Evans-ish, but a bit less somehow. But like she would play these really beautiful sort of harmonizations and chords as she was singing. And I guess it's kind of getting more into band work. It's not so much the duo, but I just found that sort of thing really helpful.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Even like Joni Mitchell's another one.
Yeah.
The kind of things that she comes up with to accompany herself as she sings. There's obviously heaps of other great singers who accompany themselves, but sometimes I try to think a bit that way as well, that if I'm in a duo with someone, maybe I'm like what they would be playing if they were playing while they were singing. So in a weird kind of way, we kind of just become one unit.
I love that. Yeah.
Without so that doesn't have to be anything technical at all.
No.
The other night I was playing with James Sandon. We were doing this duo gig the other night actually, and I just got into singing this tune where I just started really wanting to play just like cowboy chords, just like vanilla major and minor chords in this standard, and it was amazingly, I just felt it worked really well. I did like a whole kind of 8 bars or something of just cowboy chords, just thinking, wow, that just sounds so nice. And it would just be kind of like if I was just a much less technically orientated guitarist, but I wanted to play this particular song that we were doing. That's how it would sound, if you know what I mean. So yeah, you can think about it that way as well. Like, kind of got to get a lot out of hearing what people do when they're accompanying themselves. Blossom Dearie's another one,
Yeah.
like all those great piano player singers.
Yeah. That's a really wonderful way to kind of wrap it up, Jamie, because I think, it really, I don't know, for me, it kind of really makes me think a lot about this idea of, I know, you know, this idea of being a unit, you know, and being one, but actually kind of, I think it's pretty amazing to think that you actually sometimes will actually be thinking, well, what would that person be playing if they're playing themselves? You know, like
Yeah,
that's a whole nother mindset, really. It's almost like going, not only that, but then what does that need then? Because there's such simplicity. You know, the older I'm getting, is the simplicity. You know, is where it's at. You know, like rather than make it so complicated. And you talking about the cowboy chords is just, I think it's just fabulous. It's sort of just, I don't know. It's a really good point you make. Yeah.
yeah. Well, it's not so much then. It's the rhythm and the way that you're playing those chords that make it sound like a standard.
Mm.
You know, rather than the fact of whether they're altered or got all these extensions and all that kind of jazz harmony stuff. Like, I don't know, maybe even Keith Jarrett's another one. You know how he can just just state a melody, and it might be just major and minor chords, and it's like the most amazing sort of jazz somehow. You know, and it's like, okay, I don't really understand very much about Keith Jarrett at all. It's kind of just way beyond me. But I like to listen to it and go, what would that be like if I was kind of like a jazz musician but making those sounds, and then there was this singer, and yeah.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much for joining me.
Totally my pleasure.
It's just been really wonderful, and I'm learning so much from these conversations. Like every time I have a conversation with someone, it's something new I'm learning, and I'm learning more about, you know, how the inner workings, because I tend to be a musician that I'll play with people, but we don't always talk about that. We just do. So it's amazing to be able to actually get inside, you know, not your brain, but, you know, just be able to talk about your insights and, you know, what you're thinking. So I think it's fabulous, and I really appreciate your time.